The small courthouse in rural Pennsylvania buzzed quietly with tension, a kind of anxious energy that only comes when the fate of lives hangs in the balance. Sunlight streamed through the tall, dusty windows, casting long lines across the wooden benches, illuminating the worn floors where countless trials had taken place over decades. In the back row, Emily, a 3-year-old girl, fidgeted in her mother's lap. Her small hands clutched a threadbare stuffed bear, and her wide, curious eyes darted from one figure to another, absorbing the details of a world far too serious for someone her age. Emily's mother, Sarah, tried to shield her daughter from the proceedings, aware that courtroom conversations were often harsh and adult-oriented. Yet, Emily seemed drawn to the front of the room, where a large German shepherd sat obediently beside its handler. The dog's posture was perfect, every muscle taut and alert. Its eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the room calmly, exuding a sense of controlled power that could only come from rigorous training and experience. Sarah felt her chest tighten. This dog wasn't just any animal. It was a hero, part of a team that had saved lives in the days before this trial. The courtroom had been packed since early morning. Local residents, journalists, law enforcement officers, and family members of the victims filled every available seat. Some whispered quietly among themselves, speculating about how the trial might unfold. Others sat stiffly, their faces pale with anticipation, gripping programs or court documents as if they could anchor themselves through the tense hours ahead. The judge, a tall, composed woman in her 50s, surveyed the courtroom with calm authority, her gavel resting lightly on the bench, ready to bring order when necessary. Emily's father had been unable to attend due to work commitments, leaving Sarah to manage the little girl alone. Despite her age, Emily was unusually perceptive. She had a quiet intelligence and a keen ability to notice things most adults overlooked. As she scanned the room, she noticed the faint tension between the lawyers, the twitch of a witness's hand, the subtle movements of the jury members adjusting nervously in their seats. But what caught her attention most was the police dog. The German shepherd had been instrumental in a high-profile case that had shaken the small town 2 weeks prior. A home invasion gone wrong, a frightened family, and a suspect who had nearly disappeared into the dense woods behind the neighborhood. The dog's handler, Officer Daniels, had led the search, relying on the animal's impeccable training to track the suspect without endangering innocent lives. Emily didn't know the details. She couldn't grasp the complexities of law, evidence, or guilt. But she could see courage. And the dog, with its erect ears and calm, watchful eyes, radiated it. As the courtroom settled, the judge called the session to order. "All rise," she intoned, her voice commanding yet gentle. The room complied, standing as the judge took her seat. Emily, perched on her mother's lap, mirrored the motion instinctively, clutching her bear a little tighter. The gavel struck the bench sharply, echoing through the courtroom, signaling the beginning of testimony. The first witness, a young woman named Lisa Carter, stepped forward, clearly nervous, her hands trembling as she held the Bible. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and took her place at the witness stand. Emily's gaze remained fixed on the dog. She tilted her head slightly, her small fingers pointing before she whispered to her mother, "Good boy." Sarah felt her breath catch. Those 2 words, innocent and simple, seemed to slice through the tension in the room. She looked around, noticing that some of the adults were starting to glance toward Emily, curious about her sudden focus. The dog's ears twitched almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the recognition of bravery from the smallest spectator in the courtroom. The witness began to speak, her voice shaking initially, but growing steadier as she recounted the night of the incident. Her words painted a picture of fear, chaos, and danger. Emily's wide eyes followed every gesture, every movement, as the story unfolded. She didn't understand the legal nuances, But she understood fear. She understood courage. And she understood loyalty. Her small hand gripped the bear tighter as she whispered again, her voice almost inaudible. "Brave dog." Sarah glanced down at her daughter, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. Emily's perspective was so pure, so unfiltered, that it seemed to cut straight to the essence of the situation. The courtroom, previously a maze of legal procedure and adult anxieties, now contained a small beacon of truth in the form of a child's observation. People around them were beginning to notice Emily's fascination. A few jury members exchanged subtle glances, some smiling faintly at the unexpected innocence in the room. Officer Daniels, standing beside the dog, could see the interaction. The dog had been trained to act without recognition, without praise, purely focused on duty. But the small gesture from Emily seemed to awaken a subtle warmth in the officer's chest. The dog's tail flicked slightly, a tiny acknowledgement of approval, though its training kept it perfectly composed. Emily giggled softly, sensing the dog's awareness, though she didn't understand why it made her feel so happy. As the witness continued, the courtroom absorbed the details of the investigation. Lawyers asked questions, seeking clarity and verification, while the judge observed with careful neutrality. Yet amidst all the tension, Emily remained a quiet anchor of innocence, reminding everyone present that the events they discussed were not abstract. They affected lives, bravery, and safety. Her whispered words, simple and heartfelt, began to ripple outward, unnoticed by some, but deeply felt by those attuned to human connection. Hours passed, though it felt much shorter in Emily's perception. Her focus never wavered from the dog. Each action, each tilt of the head, each movement of the paws captured her attention. She whispered again, "Good boy, brave dog," and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. A 3-year-old, too young to be fully aware of tragedy, had already conveyed more understanding than many adults in the room. The courtroom, heavy with the weight of judgment, had found a moment of humanity. When the judge called for a short recess, whispers spread quickly through the courtroom. People discussed Emily's words, marveling at the child's insight. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Officers and lawyers nodded in quiet agreement. The dog's heroism had been acknowledged in the purest form, and it resonated far deeper than official commendations or procedural praise ever could. Sarah smiled down at Emily, realizing that her daughter's simple observation had already left an impact. Emily, oblivious to the attention she had drawn, hugged her bear and smiled at the dog. The German shepherd, sensing the calm and genuine warmth in the room, wagged its tail slightly, a gesture unnoticed by most, but felt by Emily in her heart. The courtroom, poised for hours of legal debate, had already been touched by innocence. And as the judge prepared to call the session back to order, a quiet understanding passed among the people present. Sometimes the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth. The day was just beginning, and the trial was far from over. But for that moment, the tension in the courtroom softened. Emily, with her wide eyes and simple words, had reminded everyone why they were there, not just to prosecute, defend, or judge, but to witness courage, integrity, and the profound impact of actions that speak louder than words. In that moment, a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had created a bond that no legal argument could overshadow, a lesson in bravery, innocence, and the unspoken truth of heroism. The courtroom settled back into silence as the judge called everyone to order. The murmurs from the break had faded, replaced by the steady hum of anticipation. The first witness, Lisa Carter, adjusted the microphone nervously, her hands shaking slightly. She was young, barely 24, with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights filled with fear and memories she wished she could erase. She glanced at the jury, then at the judge, before finally turning toward the lawyers, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Emily, still perched on her mother's lap, hugged her stuffed bear tightly. Her gaze, unwavering, remained fixed on the police dog standing a few feet away from the witness stand. The German Shepherd sat perfectly still, its posture rigid yet calm, ears tilted forward, eyes following every movement in the room. Emily pointed softly and whispered again, "Good boy." Her mother, Sarah, felt the warmth of those words, so simple, yet so powerful in the context of the day's tension. Lisa's voice trembled at first as she began her testimony. "It was late," she said, "and I was just getting ready to go to bed when I heard them. There was shouting outside, and then it all happened so fast." Her eyes flickered toward the defense table, then down at the floor, as if trying to push away the memory. The audience leaned in. Every word carried weight. Every pause punctuated the fear and chaos of that night. Emily's little hand twitched slightly as she pointed again at the dog. "Brave dog," she murmured. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Those words, innocent, heartfelt, yet so perceptive, seemed to resonate in the silent courtroom. A few spectators glanced toward the child, smiling softly at her focus. Even the jury, trained to maintain neutrality, felt their hearts soften for a moment, reminded that courage and protection sometimes come in forms beyond human comprehension. Lisa continued, describing how the intruders had forced their way into the home. The terrifying moments when she had thought she might not survive. She described how the dog, led by Officer Daniels, had tracked the suspect's movements, how it had intervened at critical moments, and how it had protected her and her family from harm. Each word painted a vivid picture of bravery and calm amidst chaos. Emily's eyes grew wide. Though she didn't fully understand the danger described, she felt it in her chest, a small thrum of fear that she associated with the shouting and confusion Lisa had described. She tightened her grip on her bear and whispered once more, "Good dog, brave dog." Her mother's heart ached, partly for Emily's innocence, partly for the weight of the night being relived in such vivid detail. The defense attorney rose, his expression polite but calculating. He asked Lisa to clarify small details, to recount times, positions, and actions in precise terms. The courtroom tension shifted subtly as the focus moved from emotion to evidence. But Emily, oblivious to technicalities, continued to focus on the dog. She tilted her head, squinting as though trying to read the animal's expression. "He's helping," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Her mother's hand went to her mouth, silently acknowledging the unexpected depth of understanding in those words. The jury watched the interaction quietly. Emily's whispers, though barely audible, seemed to humanize the trial in ways that no testimony could. The police dog, a trained machine of obedience and skill, had become a symbol of courage and loyalty. Lisa, noticing the small child pointing, smiled faintly, recognizing the innocence and clarity in her observation. The courtroom atmosphere shifted again, less tense, more reflective, as if the child's words reminded everyone of the stakes beyond evidence and argument. Lisa's testimony moved on to the moment of confrontation. "They were cornered near the garage," she explained. "I saw the dog. It was so calm, so controlled. It just stared at them, like it knew what had to be done." Her voice faltered as she choked back tears, and the judge gave a subtle nod of encouragement. Emily's own eyes welled up slightly, instinctively connecting with the bravery she observed. Even if she couldn't fully articulate it, Officer Daniels stood silently beside the dog, feeling the energy in the room. He had trained the dog for years, and yet the quiet acknowledgement from a 3-year-old, her pointing, her whispered praise felt more profound than any formal commendation. "Brave dog," Emily repeated, her tiny finger still pointing toward the animal. A journalist in the back scribbled quickly, recognizing a story within a story. Not only had the dog saved lives, but a child had noticed it. First, Lisa concluded her testimony, describing how the intruders had finally surrendered, guided by the dog's trained presence. "If it weren't for the dog," she said softly, voice breaking, "I don't know what would have happened. I wouldn't be here." The courtroom remained silent, heavy with the weight of her words. Emily hugged her bear, sensing the emotion around her, even without fully understanding it. Her simple words, "good dog," had threaded through the narrative. A bridge between childlike innocence and stark reality. The judge allowed a brief recess, and murmurs spread quickly throughout the room. Spectators discussed Emily's comments in hushed tones, some smiling, some nodding. Even seasoned officers whispered to each other, acknowledging that a child had seen the heroism of the dog in a way that adults often overlooked. Emily, completely unaware of the attention she had drawn, looked up at the dog and smiled. Its tail flicked slightly, a tiny motion that seemed to respond to her acknowledgement. Sarah whispered to Emily, "You have a good eye, sweetie." Emily just giggled, her tiny hands stroking the bear. She didn't realize she had shifted the courtroom's atmosphere, softened hearts, and reminded everyone present of the deeper meaning behind the trial. The dog had acted out of training and instinct, yet the child had perceived the essence of its bravery. When the trial resumed, everyone's perspective had subtly changed. Lawyers spoke with renewed clarity, witnesses felt heard and validated, and the jury seemed more attuned to the human elements behind the facts. Emily's observation, repeated quietly to her mother, had transformed a room dominated by fear and tension into one momentarily touched by innocence and truth. By the end of the day, Emily's words, simple, repeated, and sincere, echoed in the hearts of everyone present. "Good boy. Brave dog." They reminded the courtroom that heroism isn't only measured in deeds, but also in the recognition of those deeds by those with unclouded eyes and open hearts. And in that moment, the smallest spectator in the courtroom had given the greatest gift of all: perspective. The courtroom had settled once more, but a subtle shift had taken place. The tension, previously taut and suffocating, had eased ever so slightly. People whispered quietly about the child who had captured the essence of the trial in 2 words: brave dog. Emily, still perched on her mother's lap, clutched her stuffed bear and gazed intently at the German shepherd, her tiny hand pointing every so often. The dog sat unmoving, alert, a pillar of calm and discipline amidst the human storm swirling around it. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked across the courtroom, her eyes lingering briefly on Emily. "I believe we have a witness whose perspective, though young, is worth noting," she said with a gentle but firm tone. The courtroom fell silent. Lawyers paused mid-conversation, spectators shifted in their seats, and even the jury leaned forward slightly. Emily's innocence had punctured the usual procedural rhythm, drawing everyone's attention. Her words were simple, but their resonance was profound. A child's perspective could cut through fear, anger, and uncertainty like sunlight through a storm. Sarah looked down at her daughter, a mixture of awe and apprehension in her chest. "Sweetie," she whispered softly, "they're listening to you." Emily blinked, tilting her head at the strange gravity of the moment. She didn't fully understand why the adults were so focused on her, but she understood courage, loyalty, and bravery. She knew the dog had been brave, and that was enough. She repeated softly, almost as if rehearsing a secret she already knew, "He's brave." Officer Daniels noticed the shift in the room. The dog, trained for obedience, had been performing its duty silently and professionally. Yet the recognition from a 3-year-old child seemed to awaken a subtle pride in him. He gave the dog a small nod, a private acknowledgement of its heroism. The dog's ears twitched slightly in response, a quiet affirmation of the bond between animal and handler, and now between animal and child. Emily giggled softly, sensing the connection, her tiny hand still pointing. The defense attorney rose, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said, "we may have overlooked a valuable witness's insight." The courtroom murmured in surprise. A child, too young to understand the complexities of law, had provided a clarity adults often failed to see. He paused, glancing at Emily. Perhaps we should consider her observations in the context of the dog's actions that night. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. In that moment, the courtroom, dominated by technicalities and procedural arguments, began to recognize the power of perspective, unclouded by bias or fear. Lisa Carter, the witness from earlier, returned her gaze to the dog and then to Emily. "She's right," Lisa said softly, her voice quivering with emotion. "The dog was brave. I don't think any of us can fully describe what it did that night, but she sees it." The courtroom was silent again. Adults, trained to analyze, to question, to dissect, found themselves humbled by the child's unfiltered truth. Emily's simple acknowledgement had pierced the complex layers of the trial, reaching the core of human experience. Bravery, loyalty, and the silent, steady presence of those who protect others. Emily's mother whispered encouragement. "Go on, sweetie. Tell them what you think." Emily's voice, soft but clear, reached across the room. "He kept us safe." The courtroom froze. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing the moment. Officers exchanged glances, their pride evident yet subtle. The dog, sensing the energy in the room, shifted slightly, maintaining its disciplined stance, but flicking its tail ever so slightly, acknowledging the young voice that had recognized its courage. The judge nodded solemnly. "It seems we have an important perspective that has been overlooked. Sometimes the smallest voices illuminate truths the rest of us miss." The words carried weight. Lawyers returned to their seats, witnesses sat straighter, and spectators adjusted in their seats, feeling a wave of emotion ripple through the room. Emily's perspective, born of innocence and honesty, had begun to reshape the energy of the trial, reminding everyone that law alone could not capture the full measure of courage. Officer Daniels felt a lump in his throat. Years of training and experience had taught him to respect the bravery of his canine partner, but Emily's simple words crystallized it in a way that no award or commendation ever could. "He kept us safe," she repeated softly. The German shepherd remained calm, but Daniels could see the pride in its eyes, the understanding that its duty had been witnessed, appreciated, and understood by someone untainted by fear, bias, or expectation. The courtroom continued, but the tone had changed. When witnesses spoke, they described not just actions, but the emotions behind them: fear, relief, gratitude, and awe. The jury listened more intently, their expressions softened by the reminder that the trial was about more than guilt or innocence. It was about courage, protection, and human connection. Emily's simple observations threaded through the proceedings like a quiet melody, impossible to ignore, and deeply moving to all who heard them. As the morning wore on, Emily remained focused, pointing occasionally, murmuring her quiet insights. "He's brave. He helped us. Good dog." Her words, repeated with childlike clarity, became an unspoken guide for the courtroom, reminding everyone of the heroism present that night. Spectators, lawyers, officers, and even the defendant's family began to understand the trial not only as a legal matter, but as a human story, one filled with bravery, loyalty, and the quiet, steadfast courage of a dog that had risked everything to protect lives. Sarah glanced down at her daughter, her heart full. Emily, unaware of her impact, continued to focus on the dog, her tiny fingers pointing as if to emphasize what she saw clearly: the courage of the animal, the bravery of those who acted, and the truth of the night. Her small voice, soft and innocent, had transformed the courtroom, from a space of tension and anxiety into a place of reflection and recognition. By midday, journalists had begun to whisper about the child witness and her observations. Social media posts would later describe the profound impact of a 3-year-old's words on a courtroom filled with adults. But in that moment, no one cared about fame, headlines, or recognition. What mattered was the raw, unfiltered truth that Emily, in her innocence, had conveyed. Her small voice had illuminated the courage of a hero who did not speak in words, but in actions. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing the courtroom to stretch and gather itself. People moved quietly, many glancing at Emily with smiles, whispers of admiration passing among the crowd. Officer Daniels knelt briefly beside the dog, murmuring, "You've done well." The dog's tail flicked again, and Emily giggled, clapping her hands softly. In the midst of a tense trial, a tiny child had created a moment of connection, empathy, and clarity that no adult could manufacture. As everyone settled back into their seats, the air felt different. The courtroom, once dominated by procedural tension and legal arguments, now carried an undercurrent of humanity, courage, and reflection. Emily's observations, repeated quietly yet consistently, had begun to weave a thread through the trial that connected all present, not just to the dog, but to the lives affected, the bravery displayed, and the simple, undeniable truth that some things can only be understood through innocence. By the end of the day's testimony, Emily's words, "He's brave, he kept us safe," had not only captured attention, but had subtly altered the way everyone perceived the case. The courtroom had been transformed, momentarily, into a space where heroism and innocence were recognized and honored. A 3-year-old girl, with her wide eyes and gentle voice, had reminded all present that sometimes the smallest observers can teach the greatest lessons. The courtroom had grown quiet again after the morning recess. The soft creak of shoes on the wooden floor, the subtle rustle of papers, and the occasional cough from a spectator were the only sounds that filled the space. But beneath this calm lay an emotional undercurrent, one that had been seeded by a 3-year-old's innocent observations. Emily, still perched on her mother's lap, hugged her bear tightly and kept her gaze fixed on the police dog, who sat like a sentinel near its handler. Every muscle of the dog's body radiated calm, power, and readiness. The judge called the session to order. "We will now proceed with further testimony regarding the events of the evening in question," she said, her voice echoing softly through the room. The audience leaned forward, waiting. Emily's tiny hand reached up and pointed at the dog, her soft voice breaking through the murmurs. "Brave dog." The words, repeated quietly, seemed to resonate throughout the room. Officer Daniels glanced at her and smiled faintly, understanding that even a child could recognize what training, courage, and loyalty truly looked like. The prosecutor called the next witness, Detective Harris, a seasoned officer with years of experience in canine units. He stepped up, adjusting his badge and clearing his throat. "This dog," he began, gesturing toward the German Shepherd, "was trained for years to handle high-stress situations. But what happened that night went beyond training. The dog didn't just follow commands it protected, it assessed danger, and it acted decisively when lives were at stake." He paused, scanning the courtroom. "Some of you may think this is just another dog in a line of law enforcement animals. But the truth is far more extraordinary." Emily's eyes grew wide. Though she didn't understand the technicalities of training, she understood bravery. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered again, "He's helping." Sarah's heart thumped in her chest. Every word from her daughter carried a clarity and purity that no adult explanation could match. The jury shifted in their seats, sensing that the trial was no longer just about facts and evidence, but about courage, loyalty, and human or canine heroism. Detective Harris continued, recounting the events of the night with precision. The suspects had barricaded themselves in the garage, he said, and the family was in immediate danger. The dog assessed the situation in seconds, moving with precision to create a safe perimeter while alerting officers to the intruder's location. It saved lives. He glanced at Emily and added softly, almost to himself, "Even a child can see what a hero looks like." Emily's small hand twitched in acknowledgement, pointing firmly. "Good dog?" she whispered. Lisa Carter, the first witness, nodded as Harris spoke. She had been terrified that night, unsure if she would survive. "I remember the dog," she said, her voice trembling. "It stayed calm, even when the intruders shouted and threatened. It moved with purpose, not aggression, protecting us without harm. I don't know how to describe the courage I saw, but even my little daughter could recognize it." The courtroom absorbed her words, the emotion in her voice filling the space more than any legal argument could. Emily clutched her bear tighter, sensing the weight of the story unfolding. Though her mind was young, her instincts were sharp. She pointed at the dog and whispered, "He's brave. He helps." Her words were simple, but they resonated with everyone present. Lawyers paused mid-note, journalists scribbled furiously, and spectators whispered softly, acknowledging the truth in a child's voice that no adult could dispute. Officer Daniels finally spoke, his voice steady but edged with emotion. "I've trained this dog for years," he said, his eyes never leaving the animal. But that night, it wasn't training alone. It was instinct, it was courage, and it was dedication to protecting innocent lives. "I don't know any adult who could have acted with such clarity under that pressure." He paused, glancing at Emily, and apparently it didn't take an adult to see it either. The courtroom was silent, but the message was clear. Bravery transcends age, species, and expectation. The defense attorney, usually focused on technicalities and strategy, rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm yet reflective, "while we continue to examine evidence, I would like to acknowledge that sometimes heroism is evident in ways that are undeniable, even to the youngest observers." The judge nodded subtly. Emily, unaware of the weight of the moment, smiled at the dog and whispered, "Good boy." Her words were tiny, but they had started a ripple that extended far beyond her small frame. Detective Harris returned to describing the moments when the dog had intervened. The suspects attempted to flee, but the dog anticipated every move. It positioned itself strategically, maintaining safety for the family while guiding officers. It didn't just respond to commands, it assessed, it protected. It acted as a silent guardian. Emily's eyes sparkled with comprehension, as if she intuitively understood the unspoken courage behind each movement. She hugged her bear and whispered, "Brave dog. Save us." The courtroom audience, moved by the cumulative testimony, began to shift subtly. Faces softened, shoulders relaxed, and some spectators dabbed quietly at tears. The jury's focus had moved from mere facts to the story of courage unfolding before them. They weren't just hearing about the dog, they were seeing it through the eyes of a child, pure and unfiltered. Emily's voice, small yet resonant, had reframed the entire trial, reminding everyone present of what really mattered: life, bravery, and loyalty. Sarah leaned down and whispered to Emily, "You're helping everyone understand, sweetie." Emily looked up, blinking, unsure of the attention she was receiving. "I see brave dog," she said simply. That simplicity, so genuine and heartfelt, pierced the formal proceedings like sunlight through clouds. The dog, calm and composed, seemed almost to acknowledge her, lifting its head slightly and letting out a soft, low exhale. Even the judge was visibly moved. She adjusted her papers, but kept her eyes on Emily and the dog, a subtle recognition in her gaze. "Sometimes," she said softly, Truth is simplest when spoken by those who see with their hearts, not their minds. The courtroom, dominated by logic and law, felt an unusual warmth, a reminder of the human and animal elements that underpin justice. By late afternoon, the story of the dog's actions and Emily's observations had intertwined, creating a narrative of courage and loyalty that transcended the legal framework. Witnesses continued to recount events, but now their testimonies carried added weight, amplified by the unassuming child in the gallery. Emily's words, "brave dog," "safe us," echoed in the room, a subtle soundtrack to the unfolding tale of heroism and protection. Officer Daniels watched quietly, pride swelling in his chest. Years of training had prepared him for this dog to act with skill and precision, but no training could have anticipated the purity of recognition from a child. Emily's acknowledgement, repeated softly and consistently, had reframed the trial. The dog had always been a hero, but now the courtroom, with all its spectators, jury members, and journalists, truly saw it for what it was. As the day drew to a close, the judge allowed a brief recess. Spectators stretched, murmured softly, and shared glances of understanding. Emily, still pointing at the dog, whispered again, "Brave dog. Good boy." Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, feeling a profound mix of pride and emotion. The trial was far from over, but the energy in the courtroom had changed irrevocably. The smallest voice had illuminated the truth, and everyone present felt the gravity of that realization. Emily, unaware of the magnitude of her impact, hugged her bear and smiled. The dog, calm yet alert, seemed to settle into a quiet acknowledgement of the child's praise. The courtroom had witnessed a rare moment, innocence recognizing heroism in a way no adult argument or evidence could. And as spectators filed out for the brief recess, they carried with them the memory of a 3-year-old girl and a police dog, whose silent connection had transformed the atmosphere, reminding everyone of courage, protection, and the profound clarity of a child's perspective. The courtroom, once tense and rigid, seemed almost to breathe differently. The morning's events, the witness testimonies, the dog's silent bravery, and Emily's small yet profound words had left an impression that lingered in the air. People shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as if drawn by an invisible thread connecting them to the story of courage unfolding before them. Even the judge, who had presided over countless trials, felt a subtle warmth, a gentle recognition that this case was no longer merely about legal arguments. It had become a story of bravery, innocence, and humanity. Emily, seated on her mother's lap, hugged her stuffed bear tightly. Her wide eyes never left the police dog, which remained stoic, vigilant, yet quietly aware of the child's attention. Her tiny hand pointed instinctively, and her soft voice broke the near silence of the courtroom. "Brave dog." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Those two words, so simple, so innocent, carried more weight than any legal argument presented that day. They reminded everyone that true courage could be recognized by anyone, even a 3-year-old. The prosecutor took the floor once more, his voice steady but with a note of reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have discussed evidence, timelines, and testimonies, but I believe it is important to acknowledge the human and animal courage displayed that night. The dog, through its training and instinct, protected a family in their moment of fear. And sometimes the clearest recognition of that courage comes not from experts, but from those who see without bias like a child." Emily's small voice broke through again, soft but clear. "Good dog. Safe us." The courtroom hushed immediately. Spectators glanced toward the gallery, the murmurs dying down. Officers shifted in their seats, proud yet humble, recognizing that this simple statement had distilled the essence of their canine partner's actions more effectively than hours of testimony. The dog, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, shifted slightly and lowered its head, remaining calm but attentive. A few of the jury members exchanged glances. Trained to focus on evidence and procedure, they could not ignore the profound emotional undercurrent introduced by Emily's observation. Her innocence had reframed the trial, highlighting not just what had happened, but why it mattered. Courage, protection, and loyalty were no longer abstract concepts. They had a living, breathing symbol in the police dog, acknowledged by a child with a heart unclouded by judgment or expectation. Sarah whispered softly to Emily, "They're listening, sweetie. You're helping them understand." Emily's face lit up, though she did not fully grasp the weight of her impact. She simply nodded, her eyes still fixed on the dog. "Brave dog," she repeated, her small voice echoing in the silent room. The journalists in the back scribbled furiously, sensing a story that was no longer just about crime and law, but about heroism, innocence, and the profound power of perception. Officer Daniels watched quietly, pride swelling in his chest. The dog had performed its duty flawlessly that night, but now it was being seen, not as a trained tool, but as a living symbol of bravery. The child's acknowledgement gave the dog's actions a depth that formal commendations could never capture. Daniels bent slightly, murmuring to the dog, "You've done well." "They see it now." The dog responded with a subtle tail flick, calm yet aware, as if acknowledging the small but powerful voice that had recognized its courage. The defense attorney, usually focused on strategy and technicalities, spoke up. "Your Honor, while the evidence and testimonies are crucial, I must acknowledge the emotional clarity provided by our youngest observer." Emily's perspective reminds us that sometimes heroism is understood most clearly through innocent eyes. And in this case, it cannot be overlooked. The judge inclined her head, her expression thoughtful. The courtroom was now united in a rare sense of reflection. The usual divisions of law momentarily softened by shared recognition of courage. Witnesses continued their testimony, but the tone had changed. Officers spoke not only of procedures, but of the emotional stakes, the fear in the victim's eyes, and the calm presence of their canine partner. Each story carried more weight now, amplified by the reminder that someone the smallest and least experienced in the room had truly seen the bravery unfolding. Emily's repeated observations had woven themselves into the narrative, connecting human courage with animal heroism, and transforming the trial into a story that transcended legal boundaries. Lisa Carter, visibly moved, glanced toward Emily. "She's right," Lisa said softly, her voice trembling. "I saw it too, but hearing it from her. It's different, pure, honest. She knows what bravery is." The courtroom felt a collective shift, a subtle softening of hearts hardened by fear, anger, or expectation. Emily, sensing the approval, giggled softly, her tiny hand gesturing toward the dog. "Good dog," she whispered again. Even members of the public gallery were affected. Some dabbed tears, others exchanged quiet nods of understanding. Emily's simple words, "Brave dog, save us," had transcended age and expectation, touching something universal. Courage, loyalty, and protection had been distilled into a single small voice, and it resonated with everyone present. For a brief moment, the courtroom was not merely a place of judgment. It was a space of recognition, reflection, and shared humanity. The prosecutor returned to the front, summarizing the significance of the dog's actions. "What happened that night cannot be captured fully in reports or photographs," he said. "But it has been captured in the eyes of a child. Her recognition of bravery is perhaps the clearest evidence of its truth. And it reminds us that courage, whether human or animal, deserves acknowledgement, compassion, and respect." Emily, perched on her mother's lap, smiled softly, her voice joining the echo of the courtroom. "Brave dog." Officer Daniels, watching the jury and spectators, felt a lump in his throat. Years of training and countless missions had taught him to respect the dog's bravery. But Emily's simple, heartfelt acknowledgement crystallized it in a way that no award or commendation ever could. "He's seen it," she whispered again, this time louder, as if confirming the truth for everyone. "Good dog. Brave dog." The courtroom absorbed the words, hearts softening further. By mid-afternoon, the energy in the courtroom had irrevocably changed. Testimonies, once tense and strictly procedural, now carried emotional weight, colored by the presence of a child who had recognized the essence of courage. The jury, spectators, journalists, and even the attorneys were reminded that justice was not solely about evidence. It was about understanding, empathy, and honoring the lives affected by the events. Emily's tiny voice had become a beacon of clarity and humanity. Sarah leaned down and whispered, "You're helping everyone see, sweetie." Emily smiled, hugging her bear, her fingers still pointing at the dog. She didn't fully understand the impact, but she understood one thing. The dog had helped, and it had been brave. That understanding, pure and untainted by the complexities of law or argument, had reshaped the courtroom. Even hardened officers and stern lawyers felt the truth of it in their hearts. As the day drew to a close, the judge called for final statements for the day. "This courtroom has witnessed more than legal arguments today," she said softly. "We have seen courage, loyalty, and innocence recognized in ways that transcend the ordinary. And we have learned that sometimes the smallest voice can teach the greatest lesson." Emily clapped her hands softly, her eyes shining, oblivious to the gravity of her words. The dog, ever calm, gave a slight tail flick, acknowledging the connection with the child who had understood its bravery. By the time everyone began to file out for the evening, the courtroom atmosphere had softened. Spectators exchanged quiet words. Officers reflected on their partnership with their canine colleagues, and journalists whispered about the story that would travel far beyond the courthouse walls. Emily, holding her bear, smiled at the dog and whispered one last time, "Good dog. Brave dog." That day, a 3-year-old had reminded everyone present that courage, loyalty, and protection were universal truths seen and understood even by the smallest of hearts. The courtroom had grown quiet once more, but the atmosphere had shifted in ways that no one could ignore. What began as a procedural trial had evolved into a story of courage, heroism, and the human and animal spirit. Emily, seated comfortably on her mother's lap, clutched her stuffed bear while her wide eyes remained locked on the police dog. The animal, calm and vigilant, seemed to sense the gravity of the child's attention. Every twitch of its ears, every subtle movement, was absorbed by Emily with quiet focus. The judge called the court to order, her voice steady yet infused with a rare warmth. "We will continue with testimony regarding the events surrounding the home invasion and the heroic actions of the police dog." The words carried weight. The courtroom leaned in, as if anticipating the unfolding of something profound. Emily's small hand rose instinctively, pointing at the dog. "Brave dog," she whispered, her voice barely audible but resonating with clarity. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Her daughter's 2 words had become a moral compass for the entire courtroom. Detective Harris returned to the witness stand, adjusting his notes, but looking more reflective than before. "I have recounted the procedural details," he began, "but there is a deeper truth here, one that transcends law and evidence. The dog acted with precision, courage, and instinctive bravery. Its presence kept the family safe, guided officers, and prevented further harm. Observing this courage, even through the eyes of a child, reminds us all of the value of life and protection." Emily tilted her head, eyes wide, sensing the weight of his words. "He's helping," she murmured softly, almost to herself. Officer Daniels, standing beside the dog, allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. Years of training had prepared him to handle dangerous situations, But nothing had prepared him for the emotional impact of a child recognizing bravery. "I've worked with K-9 units for over a decade," he said, his voice steady yet heavy with emotion, "and I have seen courage many times. But the way this child perceives the heroism of this dog, pure, honest, unfiltered, it's extraordinary. She sees the truth that sometimes adults overlook." The dog's ears twitched slightly, acknowledging the voice of the child who had recognized its courage. Emily's mother whispered encouragement. "Tell them what you see, sweetie." Emily's small voice rang out, soft but deliberate. "He keeps us safe." The courtroom paused. Spectators, lawyers, and jury members alike shifted, sensing the emotional clarity in those words. Her 2 short sentences had distilled a complex situation into its most essential truth. The dog had acted bravely, and someone had recognized it without bias, without analysis, without pretense. The defense attorney, usually meticulous and reserved, adjusted his glasses. "Your Honor," he said thoughtfully, "I would like to acknowledge that the perspective of this child is revealing. Sometimes, courage is best measured not through reports or testimony, but through the eyes of someone unclouded by fear or expectation." The judge inclined her head subtly, signaling that the observation was noted. The courtroom felt unified in a rare way. Everyone recognized that bravery, protection, and loyalty were truths that could be felt as well as seen. The next witness, a neighbor who had called 911 during the home invasion, took the stand. "I remember seeing the dog from a distance," she began, voice shaking slightly. "Even before the officers arrived, I could see it working, assessing the situation, guiding the family, keeping them out of harm's way. When I heard the child in the gallery say, 'Brave dog,' it struck me in a way nothing else could. That's exactly what I saw. Pure courage." Emily smiled faintly, pointing again, her voice soft but unwavering. "Good dog." Lisa Carter, the original witness, returned her gaze to the dog. "I don't know if words can truly describe what happened that night," she said, her voice breaking. "But hearing my daughter recognize it so simply, so honestly, it confirms everything. She sees bravery the way children do, unfiltered and true. And it changes everything." The courtroom was silent, absorbing her words. Emily, unaware of the magnitude of her role, hugged her bear and whispered again, "He's brave." Officer Daniels felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The dog, trained for precision and discipline, had acted heroically, but now its actions were being seen in a way that transcended reports or commendations. Emily's repeated acknowledgement had changed the narrative of the trial. Her observations reminded everyone present, officers, jury, spectators, and even the accused, of what mattered most: life, safety, and courage recognized in its purest form. The jury members, usually trained to focus on facts, were visibly affected. One juror, a woman in her 40s, wiped away a tear discreetly. "It's incredible," she whispered to the juror beside her. "A child sees what we've been analyzing for hours and gets it instantly." Another juror nodded, adjusting his notes, but unable to hide the softness in his expression. Emily's voice had created a bridge between logic and emotion, reminding everyone that heroism could be recognized without technical expertise. The prosecutor returned, summarizing the cumulative impact of the dog's actions. "What we have witnessed today is not just a story of law and procedure," he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. "It is a story of courage, loyalty, and protection. And it has been clarified by the purest witness of all, a child who sees the essence of bravery without judgment." Emily's words, repeated again and again, have reminded us why we do what we do: to protect lives, and to honor those who do so with courage. Emily, sensing the emotional weight in the room, whispered once more, "Brave dog. Save us." The courtroom held its collective breath. Her words, though simple, had crystallized the entire trial into its most profound essence. Everyone present understood, on a fundamental level, that the dog's actions had been heroic, and that recognition of bravery could come in the smallest, most unexpected forms. Sarah leaned down, whispering, "You're helping everyone understand, sweetie." Emily nodded, her eyes bright, still pointing at the dog. She didn't fully grasp the courtroom's gravity, but she understood one thing. The dog had helped, and it had been brave. That understanding, pure and untainted by adult complexity, had reshaped the entire trial. Even hardened officers and stern lawyers felt the truth in her small voice. The judge called for a short recess, giving everyone a moment to reflect. As spectators stretched and whispered softly, journalists scribbled notes furiously, capturing the emotional power of the day. Officer Daniels bent slightly toward the dog, murmuring, "They see it now. You've done your job, and they understand." The dog shifted slightly, its tail flicking, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond with the child who had recognized its courage. By the end of the day, the courtroom had been transformed. The legal proceedings were still underway, but the energy was different. Spectators, witnesses, jury members, and officers alike had been touched by Emily's repeated acknowledgement. "Brave dog. Save us." Her words had reframed the trial, emphasizing that heroism is not only about action, but also about recognition, understanding, and empathy. In that small, sunlit courtroom, a 3-year-old girl had changed everything. The courtroom was tense, but charged with a new kind of energy. The proceedings had shifted from formal legal arguments to something more profound, an acknowledgement of courage, protection, and the undeniable bond between humans and animals. Emily, still perched on her mother's lap, clutched her bear and kept her wide eyes fixed on the police dog. Her small hand occasionally pointed, her soft voice breaking the stillness. "Brave dog. Good boy." Sarah glanced down at her daughter, a mixture of pride and awe filling her chest. She realized that Emily's repeated observations had begun to affect not just the spectators, but the jury, the witnesses, and even the judge. Emily had become a silent guide, reminding everyone in the room what mattered most: safety, bravery, and the quiet courage of those who protect. The judge called the court to order. "We will proceed with the final witnesses for today," she said, her voice steady, yet layered with emotion. The audience leaned forward, anticipating the culmination of the day's extraordinary events. Emily's small voice rose again, soft but firm. "Save us." Her words, though simple, carried the weight of the trial more than any legal argument could. Detective Harris stepped forward once more. "I have described the events in procedural detail," he began, "but I want to emphasize the significance of the dog's actions. When lives are at risk, instinct and courage become invaluable. The dog's bravery that night was evident to every officer on the scene, and, remarkably, to a child who witnessed it without fear or preconception." Emily smiled faintly, pointing at the dog. "Brave dog," she whispered. Officer Daniels, standing beside the dog, spoke quietly but firmly. This animal didn't just follow commands. It assessed danger, protected lives, and ensured that no one was harmed. "I have trained with K-9 units for years, but the courage displayed that night went beyond training. And to see that bravery recognized by a child, it's humbling, to say the least." The dog's ears twitched slightly, acknowledging the connection with the child who had observed its heroism. The defense attorney, usually calculating and reserved, rose to speak. "Your Honor, I would like to highlight something rare and extraordinary," he said, his tone softened. "This child, Emily, has observed bravery in its purest form. Her words, 'brave dog' and 'save us,' provide insight that transcends legal testimony. They remind us that heroism is not only about action, but about recognition, empathy, and moral clarity. And it is recognition that is sometimes as powerful as the act itself. Emily's eyes sparkled as she pointed again at the dog, her tiny voice joining the chorus of affirmation. Good dog. The courtroom, previously tense and rigid, seemed to pause collectively. Jurors shifted in their seats, spectators wiped tears discreetly, and even hardened officers felt the room soften around them. A 3-year-old girl had transformed the narrative, showing that the simplest words could carry the most profound weight. Lisa Carter, Emily's mother, rose once more to speak. Her voice trembled with emotion as she addressed the court. That night was terrifying. I was afraid for my life and my family's, but the dog was calm, protective, and brave. And now, hearing my daughter recognize it, I feel something I can't describe: validation, gratitude, and awe. She saw the truth that I sometimes struggle to put into words. Emily squeezed her bear tightly, murmuring, "Brave dog. Save us." The judge, sensing the emotional intensity, paused for a moment. It is rare that a courtroom witnesses not only the facts of a case, but also the recognition of true courage, she said softly. And in this instance, that recognition comes from the most honest source possible, a child's eyes and heart. Emily's tiny fingers pointed again, almost instinctively, at the German Shepherd. The dog sat calmly, aware yet composed, as if understanding the acknowledgement it had received. Detective Harris returned to recount the pivotal moment of the confrontation with the intruders. The suspects attempted to flee, but the dog anticipated every move. It positioned itself to protect the family while guiding officers, neutralizing threats without causing unnecessary harm. That courage, displayed in the face of danger, was noticed immediately by the family, but also, remarkably, by Emily. Her understanding of bravery and protection is untainted and pure, and her words have allowed everyone here to grasp the significance of that night. Emily leaned closer to her mother and whispered softly, "He helped. Brave dog." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Each witness, juror, and spectator felt the emotional clarity of those words. Legal proceedings, arguments, and evidence had all been important, but this moment, the recognition of bravery by a child, was transcendent. It humanized the trial in ways that no report or testimony ever could. The prosecutor took the floor again, his voice steady but infused with warmth. "We often measure heroism by action," he said, "but recognition is also a form of truth." Emily's acknowledgement reminds us that courage exists even when unspoken, and that sometimes the smallest observers perceive the greatest truths. The dog's actions protected lives, and the child's words have revealed the depth of that protection. This trial has become more than a legal matter. It is a story of human and animal courage, seen and understood by the innocent. Sarah glanced down at Emily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her daughter's influence. "You've helped everyone understand, sweetie," she whispered. Emily giggled softly, hugging her bear, pointing faintly at the dog. "Brave dog," she repeated, her voice unwavering. In that moment, Emily's innocence crystallized the emotional core of the courtroom, transforming it from a place of judgment to a place of understanding and empathy. Officer Daniels knelt briefly beside the dog, murmuring softly, "You've done your job, and they see it now." The dog's tail flicked slightly, calm yet expressive. Emily's acknowledgement had validated years of training, danger, and sacrifice in a single profound moment. The courtroom had been reminded that heroism is not measured solely by action, but also by perception, and that the purest perception often comes from the youngest and most innocent. As the afternoon wore on, jurors, witnesses, and spectators alike carried the emotional weight of Emily's words. The trial had become a tapestry of bravery, recognition, and connection. Emily, unaware of the magnitude of her impact, continued to point at the dog and whisper softly, brave dog. Save us. Each repetition reinforced the emotional gravity of the proceedings, drawing empathy and understanding from all who heard her. By the end of the day, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Legal arguments remained important, but the energy was now humanized, emotional, and deeply connected. Emily's words had become a moral compass, guiding everyone toward the essential truth. Courage, protection, and recognition of bravery were not abstract concepts, they were lived realities, witnessed and understood, even by the smallest hearts. As everyone filed out for the evening, conversations were hushed, reflective, and reverent. Journalists scribbled notes for stories that would inspire. Officers reflected quietly on the bond with their canine partner, and jurors whispered about the profound clarity a child had provided. Emily, clutching her bear, whispered one last time to the dog before leaving. Good dog. Brave dog. That small voice had changed the emotional landscape of the courtroom entirely, ensuring that the story of courage, heroism, and recognition would be remembered long after the trial concluded. The courtroom was silent as the day's final proceedings began. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, tempered by the extraordinary emotional journey the trial had taken over the past week. What began as a standard legal process had transformed into a story of courage, protection, and human-animal bonds, illuminated by the voice of a 3-year-old child. Emily, seated on her mother's lap, clutched her stuffed bear and gazed at the police dog. Her tiny hand pointed occasionally, and her soft voice whispered the words that had resonated throughout the trial. Brave dog. Save us. Sarah glanced down at her daughter, feeling a swell of pride and awe. Emily's simple, unfiltered observations had reshaped the courtroom in ways that no adult testimony could. Her recognition of the dog's heroism had softened hardened hearts, focused attention on the human element of the case, and reminded everyone present that courage and protection were not abstract concepts, they were lived experiences. Emily's words had become a moral lens through which the trial was now viewed. The judge called the court to order. We will hear the final statements before the jury delivers their verdict, she said. Her voice carried the weight of solemnity, tempered with the quiet understanding of the unusual emotional journey that had occurred within her courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, lawyers adjusted their notes, and spectators shifted, aware that they were witnessing not just the end of a trial, but the culmination of something far deeper. The prosecutor rose first. Members of the jury, he began, we have examined the facts, the testimonies, and the evidence. But beyond that, we have witnessed courage. We have seen protection, loyalty, and bravery demonstrated not only by law enforcement, but by a remarkable canine partner. And remarkably, we have had the opportunity to see that bravery recognized through the eyes of a child. Emily's words, simple and honest, have reminded us all what truly matters. Lives saved, and courage acknowledged. Emily leaned slightly toward her mother, whispering softly, "Good dog." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The dog, calm yet attentive, flicked its tail subtly, sensing the praise and acknowledgement that had been delivered again and again by the little girl. The courtroom's tension had softened. The emotional weight of recognition had become tangible, a quiet undercurrent, binding everyone together. The defense attorney rose, his usual formal tone softened by the day's extraordinary events. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, while we have examined legal arguments and procedural details, we cannot ignore the broader context of courage, loyalty, and protection that this trial has revealed. The dog's actions saved lives, and Emily's honest observations have made that clarity undeniable. Sometimes the truth of heroism is most clearly seen through the eyes of innocence. Her words have ensured that courage is recognized, understood, and honored. Emily, sensing the gravity of the moment, though not fully understanding it. Whispered again, "He helps." Her tiny hand pointed toward the dog, who remained composed yet aware. The jurors exchanged subtle glances, the weight of her repeated observations influencing their understanding of the case. They were reminded that the trial was not only about guilt or innocence, but about recognizing bravery, compassion, and moral courage in action. Lisa Carter, Emily's mother, spoke softly, addressing the courtroom. "That night, I feared for my family's life. But the dog was calm, courageous, and protective. And now, hearing my daughter recognize that bravery, it changes how we see everything." Her perspective, untainted by fear or bias, captures the essence of what happened better than any report, photo, or testimony. She understands courage, and she sees heroism. That recognition is invaluable. Emily squeezed her bear and whispered again, "Brave dog. Save us." Officer Daniels cleared his throat, standing beside the dog. "I've trained with this K9 for years, and I have seen courage in many forms. But Emily's recognition of the dog's actions, the purity of her understanding, reminds me why we do what we do. Not for awards, not for recognition, but to protect, to serve, and to ensure safety. And now, everyone here has seen it through her eyes." The dog's ears twitched, its calm presence radiating a quiet dignity. The judge called for the jury to deliberate. The spectators filed out slowly, murmuring softly about the extraordinary emotional weight of the trial. Lawyers whispered quietly, taking notes and reflecting on the impact Emily had made. The courtroom felt transformed, no longer just a space for legal proceedings, but a space where courage, heroism, and human-animal bonds were fully recognized and honored. Emily's words, "Brave dog, save us," had left an indelible mark. Minutes stretched into an hour as the jury deliberated. The courtroom was nearly empty, save for the family, officers, and the dog. Emily sat quietly, her tiny voice occasionally whispering, "Good dog." The dog remained near Officer Daniels, alert yet calm, as if understanding that the outcome depended not only on human judgment, but also on the recognition of the bravery it had displayed. Sarah hugged her daughter, feeling the quiet anticipation in the room. Finally, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreperson rose, clearing their throat. "Your Honor," they said, "after careful consideration, we have reached a verdict." Every eye in the courtroom focused on the jury, the tension almost unbearable. Emily's small hand pointed at the dog, and her soft whisper cut through the silence. "Brave dog." The courtroom collectively exhaled, as if her words had released the final measure of anticipation. The foreperson continued, reading the verdict with steady emotion. "We find that the canine's actions were heroic, saving lives and ensuring protection during a dangerous situation. We acknowledge the bravery of the officer and the K9 unit. Furthermore, we recognize the importance of Emily's observations, which provide a clear, unfiltered acknowledgement of the courage displayed that night." The judge nodded, a subtle smile forming, understanding that justice in this moment encompassed more than legal procedure. It encompassed recognition of bravery and moral clarity. Emily clapped her hands softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good dog. Brave dog." The spectators, journalists, and officers felt the emotional weight of the moment. The dog, calm yet attentive, lifted its head slightly, as if understanding the quiet celebration of recognition it had received. Emily's innocence and clarity had shaped the outcome in a profound moral sense, ensuring that the story of courage would be remembered by all present. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You've helped everyone understand, Emily," she whispered. Emily looked up, smiling, her small voice repeating, "Brave dog. Save us." Officer Daniels patted the dog's side gently, murmuring, "They see it now. You did well." The dog responded with a subtle tail flick, calm yet dignified, as if acknowledging the smallest voice that had recognized its bravery. The judge addressed the courtroom one final time. "This trial has been extraordinary," she said. "We have witnessed not only legal proceedings, but the acknowledgement of courage, loyalty, and protection in its purest forms. A child's perspective has illuminated truths that adults often overlook. We are reminded that bravery can be recognized by anyone, regardless of age. And that recognition itself is a powerful testament to moral clarity and justice." As the courtroom emptied, spectators, officers, and journalists spoke quietly among themselves, sharing their reflections on the remarkable impact of a 3-year-old's recognition of heroism. Emily held her bear, still whispering softly to the dog, "Good dog. Brave dog." The bond between child and canine, between innocence and courage, had transcended the trial itself, leaving a lasting impression on all who had witnessed it. Outside the courthouse, journalists captured photos and recorded interviews, eager to share the story of Emily and the police dog whose bravery had been seen and acknowledged in the purest form. Officer Daniels knelt beside the dog, whispering again, "You've done your job, and they see it now." Emily, holding her mother's hand, smiled at the dog, her voice soft but certain. "Brave dog." The impact of her words would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom, a reminder that courage, protection, and recognition are universal truths. That evening, as Emily and her mother walked home, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary day. Her daughter's small voice had changed the course of the courtroom, influenced the perception of jurors, and highlighted the moral clarity that only innocence can provide. Emily, unaware of her impact, simply hugged her bear and whispered one last time, "Good dog. Brave dog." The dog's story had been honored, and a child's perspective had reminded the world of the power of courage, empathy, and recognition. The trial would be remembered not only for its legal significance, but for the extraordinary role of a 3-year-old who pointed at a police dog and spoke the words that carried the weight of truth. "Brave dog. Save us." A child had changed everything, not by argument, not by evidence, but by seeing clearly, speaking honestly, and reminding everyone that the simplest observations often hold the deepest truths.